Good morning, everyone. We're here this morning to talk about how a sustainability group, a developer and voters came together for a large-scale, all-electric apartment complex in Newton. I'm Amy Longsworth with the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, and we have a great program today. Next slide. So GRCx, Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange, is an interactive program series that we bring you on no particular schedule as great topics come up. And we are all about accelerating the implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. And the programs are meant to be engaging and open to all. So please put your questions in the chat as we go along. We've got a team here collating the questions. I expect there's going to be a lot of interest in this particular topic. So when we get to the discussion, your questions will be in there. We have disabled the Q&A, so that will not work for you. So please use the chat. The program is being recorded, and afterward, give us a couple of days and we will have the content of the full recording up on our website, so you can go back and review anything that you see here. You don't have to madly take notes. Next slide. I'd like to introduce our panelists. First of all, we have Dan Ruben, who is an expert in sustainable hospitality and sustainable tourism. He is he's chair of the organization Green Newton, and he also leads its building standards committee. Kent Gonzales is vice president for development at Northland Investment Corporation. He's based in Newton, and he's had 30 years in a variety of real estate roles in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He does large scale and complex mixed use development projects. He is a certified passive house designer and a lead AP and a member of the AIA. Deb Crossley is a city councilor with City of Newton, and she chairs the Zoning and Planning Committee. She's also a residential architect, and she is focused on raising the bar on energy efficiency and clean energy requirements for new and existing construction, as well as more sustainable development patterns. And last but not least, Beverly Craig, a program director with the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, also a lead AP, an expert in passive house design. And I want to thank you all for being here. I think it's really cool, the different perspectives that we have gathered together to tell this story, which is partly about technology and partly about the drama of getting things done in a town. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Amy. Next slide. Okay, here we go. So this is a story of an unusual collaboration between Green Newton and Northland that resulted in the largest mixed-use passive house development in the United States. It's will also be all electric. It's also about how Northland, Green Newton, and civic groups in Newton overcame fierce organized opposition to the project so that the project is now on track. And it's about just how far we've come in Massachusetts in 5 years regarding our building standards. Next slide. A bit of background. Green Newton was founded in 1990. We're the largest environmental organization in Newton. Originally, we were all about green lifestyles, and but gradually our influence grew with both with government and the business community. Next slide. The story starts in 2018 when a developer asked Green Newton to endorse their building project. And I thought, why the heck are they in? The heck do they want our endorsement? Well, I really didn't understand the emerging politics of big construction. So they said, we have a green roof, please endorse us. And I talked to some people, we endorsed it. And then a month later, we got another such request. And then we got 2 more such requests. and we approved them, but I felt funny about it. So we decided we should have standards so that what we endorse meets our standards. So a colleague, Jim Purdy, and I called a meeting of green building professionals in Newton that have sustainability expertise. And to establish our standards, and that was the beginning of the Building Standards Committee. Next slide. So our target was big construction projects, multifamily, mixed use, and our focus was we weren't focusing on all aspects of construction, but rather the most important aspects of reducing fossil fuel use associated with construction. Passive house certification, all electric buildings, buildings that use low embodied carbon building materials, and reducing the transportation emissions associated with the developments. Next slide. I'll go over each of these briefly. For passive house is particularly well suited for multifamily. It's also used for other kind of projects. For office buildings, Massachusetts will soon have the largest passive house office building in the world, the Winthrop Center downtown. Passive house is known for being extremely energy efficient, much more energy efficient than even the previous Massachusetts stretch code. Hence, it has very low operating costs. It brings in fresh air to every room, so there's excellent indoor air quality. It's very quiet, resilient, and in Massachusetts, passive house is subsidized because it helps Massachusetts achieve its greenhouse gas goals. Next slide. So passive house is known for these principles, very high level of insulation and continuous insulation. So it's like a blanket that covers the buildings. The air leakage is very low. The ventilation has energy recovery. So the incoming air is tempered by the exhausted air, so the heating and cooling systems don't have to work so hard. Windows are very high performance, and passive house buildings are built to let in the low angle of the winter sun and block the high angle of the summer sun. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, previous slide. I must have missed that. So these are principle 2 is all electric. That goes for heating, hot water, and cooking. Next slide. Low embodied carbon materials refers to the recognition that much of the fossil fuel use associated with buildings is in the materials themselves, because it takes so much energy to make materials like steel and concrete the two biggest offenders. The solutions are to design buildings that need less steel and concrete and to use low embodied carbon products, which are just beginning to come to market. Next slide. Regarding transportation, we always favor projects that are located near transit jobs and commerce because they reduce the need to drive. They promote smart growth as opposed to suburban sprawl. But any location in Newton is going to be better than most locations further away from Boston. We also favor car sharing, enabling bicycling and walking, and electric vehicle charging stations. Next slide. So our next step was to meet with developers. We have our principles. There are two huge projects that were being proposed in Newton: Mark Development's project near the Riverside MBTA station and the Northland project in Newton Upper Falls. Our message was going to be, we will support developers who commit to our 4 principles. I thought, they're not going to listen to us. But again, I didn't really understand the emerging politics. Next slide. So the politics are that developers in Newton, and I'm sure the laws are similar elsewhere, need a special permit by a vote of city council in order to be approved. So the opposition to housing projects is organized and fierce. And so developers need supporters. Green Newton has a high profile in Newton. We're well regarded. And so we were perceived as a valuable ally. We have friends in city council and in the city government. And climate change is a growing concern. Most city councilors in Newton do care about climate change. And so we found developers were willing to listen to us. Next slide. I'll just tell one brief story. We're meeting with a big developer. We're at loggerheads. I said, look, if we don't come to an agreement, we won't oppose your project. We just won't support it. And he said, you don't understand. We need your support. So that grabbed me. So our meeting with Mark Development, December 2018, went very well. We had a great discussion. They agreed to study our proposal. They had their sustainability consultant, New Ecology, study our proposal. And over the next 6 months, they met us more than halfway. So we decided to support that project, and it is underway. Next slide. With Northland, that meeting didn't go quite so well. That was the following month, January 2019. They presented us their sustainability plan. They said that it's LEED certifiable. And we said, well, to earn our endorsement, it has to be Passive House. Well, Kent Gonzales, our next speaker, was discouraged, very, very discouraged. He said, you environmentalists, you're changing the goalposts. You environmentalists wanted LEED, and now you say Passive House. So I figured we lost them. And a few weeks later, next slide, we found that they hired Stephen Winters Associates, a prominent consulting firm, to study our proposal. Again, I was floored. Over the next 2 years, the project kept getting better and better. Kent will talk about that. Northland faced big political challenges. It had to win the city council vote, and then it needed a 2/3 vote. And once it passed, the opposition gathered signatures and put it on the ballot. So then we had a referendum fight. Both Kent and Deb will talk about that. Meanwhile, Passive House, which was not terribly well known in 2018, has in the last 5 years become, in some cases, a requirement in Massachusetts. And Craig will talk about that. Next slide. So over the coming 4 years, the Building Standards Committee worked with at least a dozen more developers. Now developers call us early in the project to meet with us. We work on multifamily, mixed use, and senior housing, and we've been persuasive. Our message that one of our messages that's persuasive is to say the laws are getting tougher. The marketing, the demand is for more sustainable buildings, and developers hear that. We, particularly Bev Craig, identifies funding for Passive House studies and for Passive House construction, and that's very helpful. We tell them that they need to have very good architects and engineers that understand Passive House, and we put them in touch with such people. And a lot of developers care about climate change too. And so that message resonates as well. Next slide. So in the last 5 years, we've seen a remarkable change in building requirements. Passive House is now required for multifamily houses over 12,000 square feet in those communities that have passed the specialized stretch code. So far, since the beginning of the year, 22 have passed it, and there are more every month. I cannot emphasize enough how important Burdo in Boston, soon in Newton, and Budo in Cambridge have been. These provide requirements for all large buildings. In Newton, it will be buildings over 20,000 square feet. It demands net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and to hit interim targets. What that means is if you're going to build a new building, it makes no sense to put fossil fuel into that building because the owners will just have to swap it out before long. And it makes sense to make the buildings very energy efficient. Regarding electrification, soon, next year, 10 communities will require electrification in Massachusetts. And we're optimistic that Massachusetts will allow more communities to require electrification in all new construction also. Next slide. Low embodied carbon, few people knew about it in 2018. It's increasingly well recognized, and there are more, and these products are beginning to come to market. Regarding transportation, Massachusetts passed the MBTA Communities Act. It enables more housing near village centers. The fly in the ointment is that the housing opponents are still out there and organized, and they are slowing smart growth, and which leads to more suburban sprawl and more driving. And on a good note, the EV, we used to have to persuade developers to install EV charging stations. Now we don't need to do that. Every developer knows that they need to install EV charging stations. And now I will turn it over to Kent Gonzales.
Thanks, Dan. Now I get to tell our version of Dan's story. So when we started this project back in 2000, well, we really went public with it in 2016, but by the time we started the formal process in 2018, even in 2016 when we started, we were pretty proud of our sustainable approach, and include that was really centered around LEED certifiability. So when we went in to meet with our friends at Green Newton, we sort of ran into a bit of a buzzsaw of green thorns. And I'll talk a little more about that a little later, but suffice it to say that the story started off with a little bit of tension, but ended up a great story that could have ended up with, like I say, tension that turned into adversarial relationships, really turned into a very strong partnership that we owe a lot to not just Green Newton, but other members of the community in Newton for the success of this project. This slide shows the project as it will appear when it's completed. And one of the fun facts I wanted to illustrate here was, you notice the red and white tower in the background, that's Channel 7 tower. People wish we could remove it, but we just like to remind that it's only 3 meters shorter than the Eiffel Tower. So just pretend that it's something else. Next slide. The site, for those of you who are familiar with it, is located about a mile off of 128 on Needham Street in Newton, Lower Upper Falls, and not very far from Route 9, which is the road up at the very top, cutting across diagonally on the slide. Next slide. The site's about 23 acres, and what this image shows what the site looked like before we completed our demolition. On the lower portion of the site actually is Oak Street. Needham Street is on the right side, and you'll see it in the north and eastern quadrants of the image are really the commercial character of the neighborhood around us. And along the south and the west side of the image is really the residential character of the project. And directly south of the site, that residential neighborhood, at one time was worker housing for what was the Saco Petty Mill industrial complex. And there still are a couple of the original employee housing homes that are still exist in the Saco neighborhood, as it's called. But in this image, all of the buildings have been demolished, except at the very lower edge of the site, you'll see a long linear building that is the Saco Petty Mill. That is really a central and key component of the project. Next slide. Now, when we started this project, you'll see here a lot of vision statements, and you probably see these same statements on pretty much any large mixed-use project, call it planning mumbo jumbo. But in our case, we really believed in all of this, and we are going to execute on all of this. Now, if you look at towards the bottom of the slide, this vision states forefront of sustainability. That's not how it started. We just wanted to be sustainable, and we thought being sustainable was incorporating LEED into our project. But as time went on and our journey took us through to Passive House with Green Newton, we formed a very strong commitment to passive house and learned that we were going to be on the forefront. Just didn't know it at the time. Next slide. So the project is 22 acres. 10 of those acres, are almost 40% of the site, are open space. There are 800 apartment units. All of our residential units will be apartments for rent. Of those 800 units, 140 are affordable. We have 180,000 square feet of office in the restored Saco Petty Mill, and 95,000 square feet of ground floor activated retail to support this village. And we have capacity for 1,600 cars. About 110 of those cars are on the surface. All of the rest of them are underground, which provide a great opportunity for exciting urban design for this site. And we will also be providing a shuttle or microtransit, free shuttle or microtransit to the Newton Highlands T station. Next slide. I won't go over all of these items, but these are our sustainability goals and objectives and our strategies. And the key one is passive house. It just says passive house, but that really is passive house certification. There are a whole slew of other things there as well. But the key thing is that, or not the key thing, but one thing that we're very proud of that we've accomplished already is we have 2 buildings that are passive house certified, pre-certified, another one that's very close to being pre-certified. But in addition, in May of this year, we learned that we were LEED for Neighborhood Development Gold certified. So we are on our way. Next slide. This is the site plan, and all of the buildings in this image are now passive house. When we first worked with Green Newton and got to our special permit approval process, we agreed that we would commit at the time to only 3 buildings being passive house certified. That was building 3, building 4, and building 8. And over time and through our journey, we ended up finding out it was made way more sense just to have all of them passive house certified. Next slide. This slide illustrates the public open space. And you'll see in the north, there's the South Meadow Brook. We have 6 parks. The South Meadow Brook is actually an exposed area of a brook that, as it passes through our site, goes into a culvert and is buried. But this portion had long been neglected. And this summer, we completed the restoration of the South Meadow Brook, removing invasive species, over 40 invasive trees. And that site now, that portion of the site is now in its stabilization phase. But the key park, there's 2 key parks here, the Village Green, which really is the heart of the project and provides a natural gathering area. Newton is known as the city of 13 villages. We'd aspire to be the 14th village, but don't think we'll ever make that. But we do have a village center, a Village Green, which many of the other villages do not have. And one of the other components that's important to us is the community playground you see over on the left side. We'll be also constructing, as part of that community playground, a splash pad, which will be only the 2nd splash pad in Newton. And hopefully that'll open up in the summer, fall of next year. Next slide. This slide shows our ground floor activation. The sort of salmon color are our food and beverage uses. The teal color are soft and hard good retail. And if the building, it's building 7 off of Needham Street, you see the little yellow area, that building, or that space is the mobility hub where people will come and gather. They can wait inside the workspace while they're waiting for the shuttle or a microtransit to take them to Newton Highlands T station. Next slide. This is a view of building 5 from the Saco Petty Mill. You can see in the upper right-hand corner is a key plan showing the view. Now, one of the things that I want to point out in this building, one of the reasons we were opposed to passive house in the beginning, not understanding it, was that we just saw it as a program that required small windows. And what's ironic is we learned more, and engaged with Stephen Winter and started really looking at the design of these buildings. The passive house was the pathway for us to get large windows. If not for the passive house design standards that we implemented, we would not have been able to have large windows. And this building actually has a curtain wall and meets passive house standards. So we feel like we're on the cutting edge of passive house. When we started this, our journey in passive house, another reason we were reluctant is because there really were no examples anywhere in the United States of a project of this scale, particularly market rate, that had really been built to passive house standards. There were several affordable projects, some in Massachusetts, a lot in New York, but almost all of them were affordable and none on the scale as what we were contemplating. So we were, just to say it mildly, a little nervous. Next slide. This is one of the laneways as a result of undergrounding all of our parking. This is sort of an interior auto court between buildings on block 5 and 6, which you see up in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. And really, these are just passive spaces off of the street for people to gather. They also serve as a low-key service access point for these buildings. None of our buildings have a backside, if you will. Every building is active on all fronts. Next slide. This is building 3, and looking at building 3 from building 5, you can see the Saco Petty Mill, the atrium to the Saco Petty Mill in the lower right-hand corner. Next slide. And this is the Saco Petty Mill, and this is the central atrium that we're going to put into the building. The building is actually 7 buildings cobbled together over time, so there's really not a central core. So to make it a viable office building, we need to create a central core. And one of the benefits of having this open atrium, this glass atrium that opens up onto the village green, is that people will be able to see into the building and see the heavy timber frame, especially at night. So we're pretty excited about that. Next slide. Okay, so how did we get here? So this project's been around for a long time, and we started master planning internally, having informal meetings with city staff, city leaders, way back in 2014. 2016, we announced the project formally to start a more open and aggressive community engagement process to really start getting feedback on the project. And again, at that time, 2016, boy, we were pretty proud of ourselves. We were going to be LEED certifiable, and we thought that was pretty awesome. Again, passive house, to our knowledge, really nobody knew what it was on our team. So after all of those meetings and we finally got the plan to a point where we could formally submit it. So in August 2018, we submitted our formal application. 2019, we actually, let me skip a little. This is really more about the conversations we had with Green Newton. So in early 2019, we started having these conversations, as Dan talked about. We had our first meeting, and we were severely humbled by them not being impressed with our LEED certifiable approach. We thought we went in pretty full of ourselves and pretty proud. And like Dan said, he makes it sound very nice. They sort of beat us up a little bit. So but it was all, they did it in a very constructive and a way that really encouraged us to, think twice about what they were saying. So as he said, we went out and we hired Stephen Winter to come in and teach the entire team. We had 2 architects, our construction manager, our MEP engineer, our staff, what Passive House was about. They took one of our buildings and provided a case study of how that building, building 3, which you saw an image of earlier, how that building could become Passive House certified. So it was based on that, really, that by the time we got to the special permit process and continuing to work with Green Newton, that we committed to doing the 3 buildings Passive House. And at that time, again, things are moving so fast technologically that at that time we were still planning on using gas for our domestic hot water. We agreed that we would continue to find a pathway to get to all electric, but at that it was still difficult. Even Passive House, given the region we were in, really almost preferred gas because it was a cheaper source of energy and a more efficient form of energy to power the buildings or to power the hot water. But we kept trying to find a way to incorporate all electric into the buildings. And then at the same time, we decided that we were going to look at LEED certification. Not that that mattered that much to Green Newton, but it still mattered to us because LEED still covers things that Passive House doesn't. Passive House obviously is super focused on energy efficiency, whereas LEED still covers quite a other aspects of the building that related to health and wellness and materials that Passive House at the time did not. So 2019, we got our approval from City Council, and by 2020, we decided, well, you know what, we're going to commit to the entire project being Passive House, and we committed to LEED certification for multifamily, for homes on all of the buildings, and we are also able to commit to all electric. And it just, our journey as we continue to evaluate our buildings, what we wanted to do with them, and understanding the quality of life it provided for the residents, it just made so much sense for us to continue on the path to incorporate all of the buildings and make them all Passive House. And again, at the time, we were definitely on the forefront because we were at the time the largest Passive House all electric project in the world, according to Stephen Winter. We thought that was kind of a big place, so we just, if we talked about it, we would just say in the United States, and we're still one of those. Charlestown has probably the largest Passive House project with almost 3,000 units. They're recently started construction, but honestly, I don't know if it's all electric or not, but nevertheless, it's pretty exciting. That's in our backyard. Next slide. So now, kind of, as I mentioned, you know, from 2016 on, we had all kinds of community meetings. There was nobody we wouldn't meet with. We would meet with anybody. We had meetings in homes. We had meetings in the Saco Petty Mill. That's what you see in the upper left-hand corner. We had a fall festival with Ferris wheels and free food. And the purpose of that was to draw people to the site so they could really understand what the site was about. Most people in Newton had been around the site, but had never really been on the site to see how large the site was. And we took the opportunity to explain to people what the project was all about. Next slide. Now, this is where the not so much fun part starts. Once the project was approved in 2019, there was a group called Right Size Newton that forced a referendum, a ballot issue for the city to vote on whether to uphold the zoning on the project. And so that was a little nerve-wracking, as you can imagine, because we had risk, we could potentially, this would have killed the project if it had been overturned by the city. But with this referendum, we really couldn't get out and try to sell the project. It really took the community. And next slide. Because of our involvement over the years in the project and in the neighborhood, there was a massive groundswell of grassroots support for the project. People were coming out of the woodwork to support the project, to knock on doors, to educate their neighbors about the value and the benefits of the project. The image on the left is two city councilors and someone's their living room explaining the project, building support for it. On the right is a community meeting with the mayor, two city councilors, including Councilor Deborah Crossley, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, as well as a local community leader, again, holding a meeting to educate their constituents, their community members about the value of the project. Next slide. And you can see here the group that formed was called Yes for Newton's Future. And you can see it was unbelievable, really, the effort that they put forth in getting out to sell and to make sure this project was successful and didn't get turned down. Next slide. So lo and behold, in March of 2020, just before COVID shut us down, there was an election and we were successful. And when I say we, I don't mean Newton, I don't mean Northland, I mean Newton. We, the community, was successful in seeing that the project was saved. It was an 18,000 to 13,000 vote. That some people say that was an overwhelming victory. It still seemed pretty close to me. Next slide. Can't go anywhere without giving a shout out to our incredible team that's been with us over the years and still with us, bringing this project to fruition. And what I'd like to do next slide is take you all on a tour of the site. And as we go through this tour, you'll see that the project is, we've branded the project as Pattern District. And there's a history to that. And we can go ahead and start the video. There's a history to how we came up with Pattern District because of the manufacturing equipment that was created here. They had a pattern house and we just built off of that. Obviously, this is an aerial view and we'll sweep right down onto Needham Street and then we'll go down. This is looking at Mill Park, which is between the Saco Petty Mill and Building 3. We're coming on to Needham Street. This is Building 2, one of our only retail pavilion. We're going to turn left onto Main Street behind one of our shuttles to Newton Highlands. And on the right actually is Building 7, where the mobility hub is located. That building is a CLT building. And the mobility, this is Mobility Plaza that you're looking at here, where people will gather to catch the shuttle. As we continue down Main Street, Building 3 is on the left, Building 6 is on the right. We're going to be approaching the Village Green on the left, and you'll see the Saco Petty Mill in the background. And also what you'll see in the middle of the site are reclaimed structural members from what was the train shed to serve as sort of a primary focal point for that, for the Village Green. Moving on down, this is Building 5 on the left. I'm sorry, Building 4 on the left. And Building 5 on the right. And we'll be coming down to what is called Carden Lane. And you'll see over to the left, the community park and splash park that will be constructed this summer, opening in the fall. We'll take a right down Carden Lane and you'll see here how the structures and the residences scale down to really meet the neighborhood, if you will. Continue down Carden Lane. And again, these are all passive house structures, and straight ahead is Building 8. But then more importantly, in the foreground to the left is the South Meadowbrook restoration that you're really just getting a glimpse of here. We're turning on Lattice Road. You're looking at the Saco Petty Mill, taking a left. This is Building 6B. Then on the left is Building 8. This will be an all-age friendly design building. All the units will be designed to Universal Design Standards. And then we're coming out again. This is Building 7 on the right, the CLT building, the Mobility Plaza, Mobility Hub on the right as well. And then we'll end on Needham Street. And that's Pattern District, or NND. So turn it over to Deb. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone. Can you hear me all right? I am so proud to have been part of this project, which I was able to support early on, and it's literally in my backyard, and I can hardly wait to see some of this get above ground. As we see—
Deb, could you speak up? You're real quiet.
I am. Okay, sorry.
Is this better?
Much better.
Great. As we see, for new ideas to become part of the collective consciousness takes a lot of time, persistence, and building real understanding. Politicians want to be seen as doing good things, but increasingly complex technical subjects like building standards, codes, high performance buildings, clean energy technologies, embodied carbon are difficult to absorb and incorporate for many. In 2008, Newton adopted broad language requiring petitioners to demonstrate a reduction in energy and natural resources as a criterion for granting special permits. But it took some years for the council to understand what it needed to ask for. As leaders of the High Performance Buildings Coalition, a group unique to Newton at the time, BSC member John Cantar and I gave a presentation to the Council Land Use Committee. This was before I was a city councilor, focusing on energy efficiency and durability to help inform what councilors should be looking for. But I think it fell kind of flat, because still in 2009, when I'm proud to say Newton was the first municipality to adopt the Mass Stretch Energy Code, you remember what it was at the time, most city leaders thought that was all that was needed to satisfy that special permit criterion. That was not the idea. So I was elected and began serving in 2010, and I served on the Land Use Committee for my first 10 years. While doing that, I was able to advocate for more clarity and specificity to help both petitioners and the council understand the measures that could and should be employed that go above and beyond minimum requirements. I asked for a sustainability narrative, not just a LEED certifiability, which people didn't understand. Then it was required. I asked for a tiered approach to adopting measures, specific measures, a list of things that would be required by the special permit that the petitioner would agree to, and a second list of measures required to be fully assessed during design development, then shared with staff and councilors before final permits would be issued. We had a lot to learn, all of us. So as climate change became of increasing concern to constituents, so some of us have been concerned since the 1970s, but when it became more of a community-wide concern, they're asking, what can we do to assure a cleaner future and build in climate resiliency? Politicians then increasingly need to be able to speak to these concerns. Enter the Green Newton Building Standards Committee in 2019. At a point where we needed to get much more in the weeds on some of this stuff. Right away, members of BSC provided invaluable assistance drafting ordinance language to specifically inform special permit sustainability requirements, which council adopted in 2019. It was particularly important to helping us build support for this project when the council decision was challenged and put to voters in a referendum. Their work helped build a coalition of residents in support of the project, from environmentalists to housing advocates, supporters of strengthening local economy, and general activists. All eventually, no matter what place people were coming from, understood that the unique attributes that made this project desirable as a whole. And together they led a campaign to victory in March of 2010, as you just heard from Kent. It was a unique and unprecedented gathering of community interest to support a goal. Building Standards Committee of Green Newton has earned the respect of both city staff, our sustainability team, planning department staff, and importantly, members of the city council since they entered the stage on all issues related to building energy efficiency, clean energy, and sustainable development. As you heard, and it is true, they are now sought after by developers and their attorneys who want to propose projects to the city council for their input early in the process, looking and hoping to achieve their endorsement. The Building Standards Committee weighs in on everything now, from new Massachusetts codes, helping us to adopt, to inform. And then the council did adopt the specialized code, which in Newton will be effective in January in 2024. They are now part of a coalition in support of Newton's overlay zoning proposal that we will use in part to comply with MBTA communities, leading, I think, understanding even among environmental groups who now understand really clearly how community development patterns are important, are really critical to how we meet the future on better terms regarding impacts of climate change. And as you heard, we are about to take up our Building Energy Reporting and Reduction Disclosure Ordinance, or BERDO, for Newton, And we're counting on, and I'm counting on BSC to weigh in on this ordinance to assure that we are building increased energy efficiency and clean energy in existing construction. So I'll just close by saying and recognizing that the members of BSC have unique skill sets. Combined, they have a wide range of professional expertise, and that's been very important to informing their work. But I think more importantly, it's not just their skill sets, but it's how they deliver their message so that a wide range of folks coming from different backgrounds, different expertise can hear them. Whether that's developers, members of the city council, or the general public. And I think they have a great time doing it. And I think that comes through as well. Their persistent but non-confrontational ability to convey useful information has been not only important to, many city leaders, and of course we change our complexion every 2 years. But special permits and developers, but to the general education of all of us. And I suppose I just really want to express my extreme appreciation for my friends and neighbors on the Building Standards Committee, and hope that they will continue their work for some time to come. And that's all I have to say. I believe I need to recognize Beverly Craig for the final presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Deb. So I'm just going to close out by trying to show you how much Passive House has scaled up since the beginning of this story. I think Kent was talking about how the Northland team was a little uncomfortable because there weren't a lot of examples in Massachusetts in particular, and especially in the market rate area, but we're seeing huge scaling up of Passive House developments in the state. Right now, the Mass Save incentive of $3,000 per unit, there are over 198 buildings that are 5 units or above that have applied for that funding. And that is equivalent to over 13,000 units that we're going to see over time. So we're just seeing going from what was 1 building in 2016 to over 200 in the next several years. Very large change, very quick. Next slide, please. And I won't go into detail, but this is like showing where, like what size those buildings are. You see a lot in this mid-rise 4 to 9 stories, and you see about 40% of them being affordable housing in the state, which is great to see. Next slide. So back in 2016, we were hearing great things from our neighbors in Pennsylvania and New York, and even Maine and New Hampshire projects about how great Passive House was. And there was a lot of concern at the time about cost in Massachusetts, and there still is today. And so Mass CEC, we're a quasi-state government agency, we said, hey, let's get some of these built. Let's track the changes in costs, and let's see what's more expensive, what's less expensive, and just try and get over that nebulous concern and put some actual data on things. And so Mass CEC funded 8 affordable housing projects. We gave them $4,000 per unit to upgrade to the Passive House standard. So low-income housing tax credit projects are slow. Many of you guys will know that. And the beauty of this is that all these projects were at 80% drawings and had at least one full bidding process with contractors when they were applying for low-income housing tax credits. So when we asked them to change to the Passive House standard, it's actually not as difficult as it would be, but just for a normal developer to try and like put eyes on what changed and what kind of numbers changed. So next slide. So the ones funded that we funded, there's been on average a 2.4% construction cost increase. So it wasn't the 10% or 15% that a lot of people were worried about. There are some differences for sure. I will say, like, upgrading a plan that's already on paper to passive house is not the least expensive way to do this. And I will say that this 2.4% increase, that's without any incentives. So you do get incentives, both federal tax credits and Mass Save $3,000 per unit to help cut that cost down. Next slide. And so what I think is interesting to people who are doing this now, maybe for the first time, it's good to know sort of like what was more expensive and what wasn't. And I would say across the board on the projects that we funded, better ventilation was the #1 cost. And that's because passive house requires fresh air in all the occupied rooms, as opposed to code, really you only have to supply 1 fresh air in that whole unit. And so that is an additional cost that is, but I think after COVID, we all recognize how important ventilation is. And after wildfires and things like that, even the market rate developments, I think there's a real opportunity to market that as a healthier thing for residents that people should recognize. The other thing I want to point out as an additional cost was there's definitely additional testing and verification all the way through development. To get these kind of levels of energy performance, you really need to make sure that what is put down on paper as an architect is being built the way it's supposed to. And I think developers, including Kent, would probably say this leads to a lot better quality buildings. And so there's a good reason, if you're going to be especially a long-term owner, you want to see this level of construction verification because it means it's a much more quality product. In all these cases too, or almost all these cases, because the envelope is so much better, you need to fund much smaller mechanical heating and cooling systems. And so there's actually a savings in most cases to offset some of the additional costs of like more expensive windows or better ventilation. And there's definitely some lessons we learned across all these projects. The first being that it was very clear the more experienced the team was and the more education they had in passive house, the lower the incremental cost was. And so like all of you who might be thinking about participating in a passive house development or an owner or a developer, please, please, please make sure your team gets educated. There is so much great stuff out there for them to take advantage of. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar, like 9 months after Mass DEC's program, the Mass Save program offered a similar incentive. That's been around for 3 years now, will be around for another 2 years. It's being proposed in the next 3-year plan. So there is free money on the design side that everyone, even if you decide at the last minute not to go passive house, should be taking advantage of. So you can get $5,000 towards a feasibility study. So Kent was talking about looking at one building and what would have to change to get to passive house. Think of this as like $5,000 in your design charrette to go really deep on the energy side of things. And then there's up to $20,000 for your architect to do the passive house modeling. And I think across the board, architects learn something from that modeling about thermal bridging and how important air infiltration is to the numbers. So again, like even if you don't go to passive house, take advantage of this. It's like free design money for a better building. And then if you actually get certification, you get $3,000 per unit, which may not pay for all the additional costs, but it takes a nice size bite out of the cost. Next slide. And you know, just a little bit more advice. The earlier you decide that you're going to go for it on passive house, the easier time you're going to have with this. And realistically, it's hard to do the first time. Expect it's going to be hard to do the first time. But we find sort of across the board that general contractors will tell us the cost and difficulty of this is not that different than what they're doing right now. And that things like minimum parking requirements or very specific design requirements, or even like idiosyncratic things that the architect might be proposing can often be way bigger of a cost than this. And this pays off in a better building, more comfort, a quieter to the street development. So there's a lot of other positive things that come out of this as well. Next slide. I think a lot of people, oh, this didn't do well in the translation to slides. But I will drop a report into the chat afterwards that has some of these graphs, but I'm just going to quickly say that I think a lot of people are very skeptical that passive house will lead to 40 to 60% less energy than the old stretch code that we had. But we have quite a lot of examples measured now that are showing that it actually delivers. And so this slide is basically all in Boston requires energy disclosure ordinance. So it's pretty easy to look at similar buildings, similar size, and what kind of energy performance. And so in this case, the far left, the green bar, is the one in 2016. That's the picture is up in the right, but it's using 63% less energy per square foot than the median of all the new family construction in Boston. Next slide. We see that also in Philadelphia, where there's energy disclosure ordinance. And I think the interesting thing here is those three green bars are all passive house, and look how closely they are hitting that energy number. I think what's odd is that both the LEED and the code buildings are all over the place, right? Like, so requiring LEED certifiable isn't delivering energy savings in that case in the affordable housing tax credits in Philadelphia. And some of the code ones, it was a developer, an affordable development trying to go to net zero. They didn't have any standard, but like some of them are great and some of them are terrible. Next slide. And then this is like the perfect natural experiment. This is in New Hampshire, 2 of basically the same building built by an affordable housing developer 6 years apart. One's passive house, one's just LEED, I think it was gold. And same owner, same architect, same operations and maintenance company, and a 49% difference in the energy used. Next slide. So the main conclusion is, like, we can really build passive house right now with a small incremental cost and a lot of benefits. Next slide. So finally, I mentioned there's so much great education out there. Part of it's that Mass Save will pay for half the cost of any professional to get their certification as a like passive house builder, certified passive house consultant. So really insist on your architects and your sustainability consultants getting this kind of education. It's really great. And then there's a lot of like much easier on-demand stuff that's out there. So Passive House Mass is an amazingly generous community of people. Kent's on their board, and those people have all gotten through passive house projects. There are certain things that are tricky, but those people are so generous about their time telling you how they got through it, how they did it at the lowest cost. Reach out to Passive House Mass, participate in their events. There's a symposium coming up in Boston on December 5th. Learn from the projects that are doing things so that you can do this as easily as possible yourself. Passive House Mass has all these recorded webinars too. So many of them are focused on building trades. And there's no reason not to make sure that your general contractor and subs have access to this. It's easy to watch whenever they want. Finally, I'll say there's an organization called Passive House Accelerator that has a video library. Some of my favorites are put on the right here. They're great, they're short, they are so targeted, and they are so practical. So please take advantage of this kind of content. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. We're going to go into a Q&A session right now. So if you can bring all of us back up on the screen. And I'm just a reminder, if we could please put your questions into the chat. We're light on questions. So I think it's Friday. People are maybe just waking up, but please, please add your questions. That was a really, really all across the board dynamic presentation with a lot of good information. I appreciate all of you coming this morning and sharing the story with us. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions just to get things rolling, and then, but feel free to respond to each other. Don't wait for me to like feed you the next question. But I thought we would just start sort of high level by talking about the the lessons, you know, for other towns and cities. Obviously, the Green Ribbon Commission is focused on Boston, and someone along the way mentioned the I believe it's Winthrop Towers Millennium Partners new high-rise office building that's also passive house. But how would you extract lessons that you all picked up in Newton and apply them to a denser, bigger urban environment?
I can sort of start off there. But I think one of the things that I think people need to realize is that Dan and his his Green Newton group did such a good job, they've almost put themselves out of a job. Because now passive house is basically required in almost all communities, you know, Boston, you know, Newton, Watertown, you know, on and on and on. So I think really developers, if they haven't already started to figure out what they need to do to make their projects passive house, they're behind. And the part of the challenge is finding the right consultant that has experience or can learn about it, because there aren't that many. I mean, our team, you know, at the time we engaged in this, our team really dove in and educated themselves. We've got people at Northland, we've got people on our MEP team, on the architects teams that all took coursework and became certified passive house professionals, you know, the everybody. So I think, but then still you have to have somebody that's gone through it to help you get through it. It's a difficult, as Bev said, you don't want to be doing this all by yourself because you're going to mess it up. So it's really, I think, imperative that you bring on people that know what they're doing, are willing to learn if they don't know. But it's that's really the key, I think, because it's on the doorstep. This isn't optional anymore. You've got to do it.
And Bev, can you remind us the certification we're looking for if we're out there looking for an architect?
Sure. An architect is probably going to get, so there's two passive house standards. One would be like the certified passive house consultant, which would be through FIAS, which is the Passive House US organization, or passive house designer, which would be the PHI. So Northland's team, the consultants they hired would be like the passive house designers. This Mass Save, you know, half reimbursement for the cost of getting certified is for any version of passive house, and it's for like the architects and consultants or the builders also. So your general contractor can get passive house builder or passive house tradesperson. And I'll drop the incentive that Mass Save has for that reimbursement. So it's after you take the course and pass the exam, you get half the cost back.
Great. So,
And I'm sorry, Amy, if I could say, you know, initially there were just passive house consultants or designers that you would go and they'd be part of the team. But now, given how important passive house is, it really is important not just to have that separate passive house consultant like we had with Stephen Winter, but it's imperative really that the design team, the mechanical engineers, the architects, and the contractors all have education and experience in passive house. It's going to make everything go so much easier, so much better, so much more efficiently. You can't have just one person really as this goes forward that's passive house qualified.
Yeah, like project managers from the development team side, they'd benefit from getting any of that training. Clerk of the works, like really. And what I would say is it's not specific to passive house necessarily. You learn a lot of building science that any high performance project should know. So there's no, like, even if you're going to be in a part of the state where they're not doing passive house, it's useful knowledge for any professional working on these buildings.
And if I can do it, anybody can do it.
I think you are a visionary, Kent. You were into it starting, your journey began in 2014, if I'm recalling your timeline.
Well, not the passive house journey. The passive house journey didn't happen until Green Newton kicked our butt, and that was in 2019. So, but it was still early. That was still very early for passive house. It was still, you know, passive house has sort of exploded like wildfire. LEED took years to sort of build momentum, whereas passive house has sort of been lingering in the background, but then all of a sudden it just exploded. And you really got to get, the freight train is really more like an Acela train right now. You really got to get on quick.
Are you, I don't know if you can share this with us, but are you experiencing so far in your project budget, the two, are you projecting the 2.4% or less
no.
increase?
I have this conversation with Bev all the time. Ours is different. I mean, she's got a very good baseline of buildings that were affordable housing. Ours are market rate housing. So, typically everything's a little more expensive. So we never really were deterred by what the passive house component was going to cost because it just is so integrated. So, but if we were forced or people really press us on what it might be in terms of cost, we determined it's between 3 and 4% for us. But it hasn't stopped us. That's not the problem right now with our buildings or in the construction industry right now. Passive house is the least of concerns. It's really just general materials, logistics, supply chain, labor costs, everything else. But passive house has no bearing really on the challenges we face now.
I was going to ask you about, you mentioned, Dan, at the beginning that low embodied carbon is one of the standards for passive house, and nobody really talked, or for Green Newton, I'm sorry, I think is what you're telling me. You're on
For
mute.
Green Newton, not for passive house. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Okay, for Green Newton. But then
So I dropped something into the chat. So like, first of all, Ken's team has been very focused on embodied carbon, partly, I mean, I think because LEED incorporates that some, but also because he's interested in this kind of stuff. So one of those buildings is Mass Timber, for example. They really worked with their structural engineers to look at minimizing concrete and some of the structural elements so that they could reduce some of those high impact materials. And I think all the way through, they're going to be looking at new products like the Timber HP product, that's the wood fiber and lower embodied versions of anything that they might have for materials. So first, kudos to Kent and his team for being on the leading edge of this. But I did drop something in the chat. Mass DEC is very interested in more people learning about like what are the high impact, low cost things they can do related to those, both the design of a building and the materials that they're using. And so we have this embodied carbon challenge going right now. So anyone with a development project that's moving forward right now should encourage their architect and sustainability consultant to get the free tools that Mass DEC is funding so that they can sort of calculate the embodied carbon of what they're thinking about. And then there's tons of great education that we're offering through that's free, that talks about tools all the way through design to try and minimize embodied carbon. And if folks are active in this, they can also, there's also prizes, right? We're trying to tease out the best practices. So folks can submit for a prize. We have two $50,000 prizes, one for a major renovation and one for new construction, and then 9 $30,000 runner-ups. And so if people want to, that's part of the link that I put in there as well. The submissions are due March 31st of next year. So there's a little time, right, to do that work and get people up to speed. We're just really trying to encourage people to look at this issue who haven't looked at it before.
So that's a good segue to one of the questions from our audience. You mentioned substantial rehab. What can be done to bring existing residential housing to net zero? Does passive house have a role in that? What do you do about a retrofit?
So
I guess that could be multifamily or single family.
Right. So first of all, existing buildings and retrofitting them, we're still on the cutting edge. Like, think this is like 10 years behind this other stuff that we're talking about for new construction. You know, a lot of us might feel who are in the new construction field that this is all new, but really it's somewhat figured out compared to the retrofitting side of things. So Passive House International does have the EnerFit standard, which is like how to get to similar levels. Well, and it's not even really similar levels, how to be very aggressive in retrofitting for the envelope. And you can do that over time. They call it a stepwise program. FIAS, which is the US version, is working on doing something similar. I think it's called Renew. I would say it's very early. That doesn't mean there's not a lot to learn from examples under both those two standards of people retrofitting. So some of those webinars I was talking about, like you just sort for existing building retrofit, and you're going to find examples of people doing this in New York, in Vancouver, and lots of other places that you can learn from. I mean, I think the policy part of it is BERDO, right? Like that requires ratcheting down emissions or getting fines. And so that's the policy tool that we have in place right now in Boston.
Right.
And
So,
Cambridge
yeah, and we've
too.
also got 85% of the buildings built, I think is the number, 85% are built. So obviously figuring out how to apply this stuff to retrofits is, you know, a big piece of the game. I'm sorry, I was talking over someone. Was it Dan or Kent?
Oh, I was just pointing out that BERDO is coming to Newton and Cambridge has a similar program. I haven't heard that other communities are adopting such programs, but hopefully they will.
So let's get Deb in here. Deb, what's the next frontier for you as a city councilor pushing land use and sustainability and efficiency?
Well, you know, the thing that's on the table right now, that after 2 years and 10 months, we finally moved out of committee to the full council, is our plan to rezone our village centers. And so how we try to move the needle to institute different development patterns where we cluster mixed use and multifamily housing in higher densities in our village centers where there's infrastructure and transportation, more transportation options and so forth, is critical to our moving into the future. We have to stop spreading out all over the place. And that's going to take up the rest of this year, except that frees up the committee to begin its work on the BERDO for Newton. So we're going to be, it'll be refreshing. I imagine, a complex ordinance. It has been drafted and it will be before us for our November 13th meeting. So we're hoping to get that underway early next year.
And I should know this, but is Newton one of the cities that's applied to the state for the
Yes.
quote gas ban?
Yes. And one of the 3 ways you can meet the affordability requirement that keeps you in that program, which has to be met by February of 2024, is to pass your MBTA communities compliant housing plan.
And
So
I
that
saw Arlington did that yesterday, correct?
they did. They
Yeah.
did. They're way ahead of the game because they had another year to pass their MBTA communities compliant plan, but they wanted to remain as part of one of the 10 communities. So,
well, it's great to see this becoming a race to the top.
yeah.
So why it has to be a race? Maybe the state would open up the docket a bit, but
it's a highly controversial race all across the 107 communities, and we are not exempt from that. So we still have work to do in full council. We're planning at least 3 meetings on this subject.
terrific. Well, I think that's one of the interesting things about this cluster of people that Dan, I believe you organized to pull together, is all the different sides that have to work together to push things forward.
One of the things that's heartening is that there are so many great activists at all professional levels of, all professions. And so it's organizing has turned out to be easier than I anticipated.
Great to hear you say that, Dan, because we want to keep you. You're particularly good at it.
Thank you.
It's almost time for us to say goodbye. I want to thank all of you for joining this morning. It's been just so full of great information. Thank you for sharing. You really exemplify what someone, I guess Bev was talking about, the great sharing community of people working together on Passive House. And again, to the audience, we will post this webinar in its entirety on our website, the Green Ribbon Commission website. Will be up in a couple of days. And I want to encourage everyone to look for our next programs on the 7th of November. We have a GRCx called Campus as Lab, which is being sponsored by our higher ed working group. Best practices to increase the climate action impact of higher education institutions. And then in early December on the 5th, we have a program that focuses on the report that the Boston Green Ribbon Commission co-authored with Embrace Boston called Our Shared History, where we look at some of the racist patterns and policies in the past that have led us to where we are today with great inequities in the benefits of the climate action that's going on and how we can possibly look at changing that. So again, thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great Friday and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.